The air inside the tent was thick with the scent of burning herbs, blood, and death. Daenerys knelt beside Khal Drogo, her hands trembling as she pressed them to his fevered skin. His breaths were shallow, his powerful chest barely rising beneath the weight of sickness. Mirri Maz Duur had promised to save him, but her sorcery had felt like a deception, a cruel twist of fate that had stolen her husband's soul rather than preserving it. Jorah Mormont watched warily from the shadows, his sword half drawn, as if expecting treachery. The Dothraki horde outside was restless, whispering of omens and curses, ready to abandon their dying call. Then, something changed. Drogo's body tensed, his fingers twitched, then clenched into fists. The death rattle that had plagued him ceased abruptly. His breath, weak only moments ago, came stronger. Daenerys gasped as his eyelids fluttered open, revealing dark, ferocious eyes, not empty and lost, but filled with raw fury. "Khal," she whispered. He sat up, the effort making the muscles in his arms ripple. The shadows of the tent flickered over his scarred face, and for the first time in days, his voice rumbled through the dim space. "I live." Mirri Maz Duur's face paled. She stumbled backward, eyes wide with disbelief. This is impossible." Drogo turned his gaze on her, the hatred in his stare making her step away in fear. Daenerys felt a cold realization slither down her spine. Drogo was not the same. Something had changed in him. The near-death experience had left something dark in its wake. Daenerys touched his arm gently. "You're back," she whispered, relief flooding her voice. Drogo turned his head toward her, and something softened in his expression, if only for a moment. Then his attention returned to the trembling Maegi. "You tried to kill me," he growled. Mirri Maz Duur's lips curled in defiance, though her fear was evident. "I only gave you what you deserved." Jorah moved to intervene, but it was too late. Drogo's hand lashed out, gripping the woman's throat. The bones in her neck cracked under his grip, and within seconds she lay lifeless at his feet. The tent was silent. Jorah exhaled, shaking his head slightly, but he said nothing. Outside, the Dothraki sensed the shift in power. A Khal who had cheated death was no ordinary man. He was something more. Drogo stood, towering over Daenerys. His voice was raw, savage. "We sail for Westeros." Daenerys' heart pounded. This was it, the beginning of their war. The Dothraki horde was restless. Word of Khal Drogo's miraculous recovery had spread like wildfire, and the Blood Riders who had begun whispering of abandoning him now knelt before him in reverence. A Khal who had defied death was not just a leader, he was a god in the making, but not all among them were convinced. Kotho, once a loyal Blood Rider, stood with his arms crossed, his gaze sharp with doubt. "Khal," he said, his tone measured. "The Dothraki do not cross the poison water." The other warriors murmured their agreement. The Dothraki Sea had always been their domain. Westeros, with its stone castles and armored knights, was alien to them. Drogo's eyes darkened. "Are we sheep, Kotho? Afraid to leave our pens?" He took a step closer, his towering presence like a storm cloud about to burst. "I have seen death and spit in its face. If the gods could not take me, then no man across the sea will stand against us." Daenerys stepped forward, her voice calm but unyielding. "The Seven Kingdoms are weak. Their king is old, and his rule is crumbling. If we strike now, we will take what is ours." Some of the Blood Riders nodded. Power spoke louder than reason, and Drogo's strength was undeniable. But others hesitated. The Dothraki were not sailors. How would they cross the poison water without losing themselves to the depths? That question was answered the very next day. A merchant fleet from Qarth arrived at Vaes Dothrak, seeking to trade with the Horse Lords. Their ships were swift and sturdy, manned by crews who knew the waters well. Daenerys, recognizing the opportunity, approached the lead trader, a shrewd man named Zaro Shoan Daxos. You wish to claim a kingdom across the sea? Zaro mused, stroking his thin beard. Such ambitions require generosity. Daenerys knew what he meant. Help us, and when I sit on the Iron Throne, Korth will have my favor. Zaro chuckled. Favors do not fill coffers. Gold does. Drogo, who had remained silent, now spoke. His voice was a low growl. You will help us, or I will take your ships and feed your crew to my horses. Zaro swallowed hard, suddenly understanding the kind of man he was dealing with. A fair arrangement, he conceded, forcing a smile. I will provide the ships. And so the great crossing began. The Dothraki, who had never set foot on a ship, were uneasy. The rocking of the waves unsettled even the mightiest warriors. Many of them swore they would rather face 1,000 enemies than another day at sea. But Daenerys was unwavering. She stood at the front of her vessel, the 3 dragon eggs she had carried from her wedding resting in her quarters. She still felt something in them, something alive, but they had yet to hatch. She watched Drogo with admiration. He hated the sea, but he did not show it. He stood as if the water had no power over him, his confidence keeping the warriors in check. One night, as the moon cast silver light over the dark waves, he approached her. You are strong, moon of my life, he said. Stronger than when I first took you. She turned to him, her violet eyes searching his. Because I had to be. Drogo smirked, brushing a strand of silver hair from her face. When we land, we burn their cities. We take what we want. We will carve your kingdom from their bones. Daenerys hesitated. Not all must die. The people, they may follow us. Drogo studied her. To him, power was taken, not given. Yet she was his Khaleesi, his queen. He would listen. For now. After weeks at sea, the Dothraki fleet sighted land. The shores of Westeros stretched before them, and the first city in their path was King's Landing itself. Drogo smiled. It begins. The Dothraki fleet crashed against the shores of Westeros like an oncoming storm. The moment the ships touched land, Khal Drogo led his warriors onto the beaches, their war cries piercing the salty air. The Seven Kingdoms had never faced an invasion like this, not from the sea, not from a force as savage and relentless as the Dothraki horde. Daenerys dismounted from her ship, her boots sinking into the wet sand. Westeros, the land of her birth, the throne that had been stolen from her family, was finally within reach. She could taste the salt in the air, feel the weight of destiny pressing upon her. From their vantage point, the city of King's Landing loomed in the distance. Smoke from 1,000 chimneys curled into the sky, unaware of the destruction that approached. Drogo turned to Daenerys, his dark eyes burning with hunger for conquest. This city falls tonight. Jorah Mormont stepped forward, shaking his head. Khal, the city has walls, defenses. We cannot charge blindly. We should send scouts, learn their weaknesses before attacking. Drogo's jaw tightened. Patience was not his way. He was a conqueror, not a schemer. But before he could speak, Daenerys placed a gentle hand on his arm. He is right, she said. We take the city, but we do it wisely. Drogo exhaled through his nose, his frustration evident, but he nodded. Then send the scouts, but if we wait too long, I will take their heads myself. Jorah gave a slight bow, relief flickering across his face. It will not take long. News of the invasion reached King's Landing before the first Dothraki scout even set foot inside the city. King Robert Baratheon sat in his chambers, his face red from too much wine, slamming his goblet onto the wooden table. The Targaryen bitch has come, he growled, and she's brought the horse lords with her. Eddard Stark, standing at his side, clenched his jaw. If they are truly here, we must prepare the city. The Dothraki are fierce, but they cannot take King's Landing if we hold the gates. Robert waved a hand, still drunk. Let them come. I'll gut the savage myself. But behind him, Cersei Lannister sat in silence, her mind already calculating. If the Dothraki took King's Landing, what did that mean for her? For her son? Tywin Lannister was already on the march with Lannister forces, but they were miles away. The city guard was weak. The gold cloaks could not hold against thousands of screaming horsemen. For the first time in years, Cersei felt fear. "The city will burn," she whispered. And then the bells of King's Landing began to toll. Night had fallen when the first Dothraki riders appeared at the city gates. Hundreds of them, moving in eerie silence, their curved araks glinting in the moonlight. The guards on the walls watched in fear, gripping their spears with sweating hands. Then, without warning, chaos erupted. Flaming arrows rained down from above as the Dothraki screamed their war cries, charging toward the gates with terrifying speed. King's Landing had faced rebellions before, but nothing like this. The gold cloaks faltered at the first clash, unable to withstand the sheer ferocity of the invaders. The city gates were battered by flaming logs, war horses rearing as they trampled anyone in their way. Drogo was at the front, a force of nature. His arak sliced through armored men like butter, each swing sending bodies crumpling to the ground. The Dothraki warriors, seeing their Khal drenched in blood, only fought harder, their war cries growing louder. In the heart of it all, Daenerys stood, watching the battle unfold. This was not how she had imagined taking back her throne. The streets were running red, the air thick with the scent of burning flesh. But she did not turn away. She was Targaryen, and this was war. King's Landing was burning. The Dothraki horde had shattered the city gates, pouring into the streets like a tide of death. Flaming arrows streaked across the night sky, setting rooftops ablaze. Screams filled the air as terrified citizens ran for their lives, trampled beneath the hooves of war horses. Khal Drogo led the charge, his arak gleaming with blood. He fought like a demon, cutting down knights in their gleaming armor as if they were nothing but wheat before the harvest. His warriors followed, their savage cries echoing off the stone walls. Inside the Red Keep, the nobility panicked. The halls of power, once filled with arrogance and intrigue, now stank of fear. Robert Baratheon, drunk and furious, shoved past his guards, gripping his warhammer. "Where is the savage?" he bellowed. "I'll crush his skull myself." Eddard Stark grabbed his arm. "Robert, you're in no condition to fight. We must retreat." Robert swung away from him. "Retreat? Like cowards? No, I will fight." But before he could charge into the fray, the doors to the throne room burst open. A Dothraki warrior stood there, blood dripping from his arak. Behind him, the sounds of death and slaughter filled the halls. Robert lifted his warhammer, his drunkenness momentarily forgotten. "Come and die, you horse-riding bastard!" The warrior lunged forward, and the battle for the Red Keep began. Daenerys stood on the steps of the great sept of Baelor, watching her husband carve his way through the defenders of King's Landing. The city was hers, but it was not as she imagined. Women wept as their homes burned. Children clung to their dead mothers. The stench of blood and smoke hung in the air. Jorah Mormont approached her, his armor splattered with gore. "It is done, my queen," he said. "The Red Keep has fallen." Daenerys turned her gaze toward the palace, where she knew Drogo was even now hunting down the last remnants of resistance. "The city is ours," she whispered, "but at what cost?" A shattering crash rang out from within the keep. Moments later, the doors flew open and Drogo emerged, dragging a limp body behind him. Robert Baratheon, the mighty king of Westeros, lay broken and lifeless, his skull caved in. Drogo lifted the corpse like a trophy and roared to the heavens. His warriors took up the cry, their voices rising in triumphant savagery. But Daenerys did not cheer. She stepped forward, staring at the ruined body of the man who had stolen her family's throne. A man she had never met, but who had been her enemy since birth. She should have felt victorious. Instead, all she felt was the cold hand of fate tightening around her throat. Far beneath the Red Keep, In the hidden tunnels beneath the castle, Cersei Lannister fled. Her golden hair was disheveled, her gown torn. Her son, Joffrey, clung to her side, pale with terror. "We should have left sooner," she hissed to Jaime, who was leading their escape. "There was no way to know they'd take the city so fast," Jaime muttered, his sword drawn. "Keep moving." Footsteps echoed in the tunnels behind them. The Dothraki were coming. Jaime turned, his hand tightening on his sword hilt. He would not let them take his sister. The first warrior appeared, a towering Dothraki with black braids swinging. Jaime lunged forward, meeting him blade to blade. The Lion of Lannister would not go down without a fight. Jaime Lannister moved like a man possessed, his golden sword flashing in the dim tunnels beneath the Red Keep. The first Dothraki warrior fell quickly, his throat slashed open in a spray of blood. But more came. Too many. Cersei clutched Joffrey to her chest, her nails digging into his arm. "We have to keep moving," she hissed. Jaime barely heard her. He had spent his entire life fighting men in steel armor, men who followed the rules of war. But the Dothraki were not knights. They fought like demons, fast and merciless. The second warrior slipped past his guard, and a rock slicing into his leg. Jaime stumbled, gritting his teeth as pain flared up his side. He killed the man with a thrust to the heart, but the next warrior was already coming. Joffrey whimpered, "Mother, do something!" Cersei looked around frantically. There had to be another way out. A hidden door. A miracle. Jaime fought on, but he was slowing, bleeding. Another blow struck his shoulder, then another. He fell to his knees. Cersei screamed as the Dothraki swarmed him. Jaime Lannister, the Kingslayer, the proud son of Tywin Lannister, was dragged to the ground and butchered like a common soldier. Cersei watched in horror as the man she had loved, the father of her children, was torn apart before her eyes. Then hands seized her arms. She fought, clawing and shrieking, but it was useless. Joffrey sobbed as the Dothraki dragged them both back toward the palace. The Lion of Lannister was dead, and the Queen of Westeros was a prisoner. The throne room was bathed in blood. Bodies lay scattered across the floor. Knights, gold cloaks, noble lords who had tried to resist. At the far end of the hall, the Iron Throne loomed, its jagged blades catching the firelight. Daenerys stood at the threshold, staring at it. The seat her ancestors had built, the throne she had dreamed of for so long. Behind her, Khal Drogo entered, his armor splattered with gore. He dragged Cersei Lannister forward and threw her to the ground. The former queen gasped, her golden hair wild and tangled, her green eyes burning with hatred. Joffrey, still sobbing, cowered behind her. Drogo eyed them with contempt. "This is the woman who ruled?" he scoffed. "She is weak." Daenerys stepped forward, looking down at Cersei. There was a time when she had hated this woman, this usurper's whore, the queen who had sat on her father's throne. But now, she only pitied her. Jorah Mormont approached. "What should we do with them, Khaleesi?" Cersei lifted her chin. "Kill me if you must," she spat, "but spare my son." Drogo laughed coldly. "The boy is weak. He is not fit to live." Joffrey shrank away, his face pale with terror. "Please," he whimpered. "I'll serve you. I'll do whatever you want." Daenerys felt disgust coil in her stomach. She had spent her whole life believing she would take back Westeros for her family, that she would rule justly. But now, the throne was hers. The war was over, and it did not feel like victory. She turned to Drogo. "Enough blood." Drogo's expression hardened. "You would let them live?" Daenerys nodded. "Cersei can rot in the dungeons. The boy will be exiled." Drogo grunted, but he did not argue. She was his queen. If this was her decision, he would honor it. The Dothraki dragged Cersei away, her screams echoing through the hall. Daenerys finally turned back to the Iron Throne. She took a deep breath. Then slowly she stepped forward and sat upon it. The Dragon Queen had conquered Westeros. But at what cost? Daenerys sat upon the Iron Throne, but the weight of it pressed upon her like a crown of thorns. The war was over. The city had fallen. The great houses of Westeros lay in ruins, their lords dead or imprisoned. But the victory did not feel sweet. Outside the Red Keep, King's Landing burned. The Dothraki, unleashed upon a land that had never known them, pillaged and slaughtered at will. Their way of war was not one of conquest and diplomacy, it was one of fire and blood. Daenerys had stayed her husband's hand when it came to Cersei and Joffrey, but the streets ran red nonetheless. She stepped down from the throne and turned to Khal Drogo, who stood at the base of the steps, watching her carefully. "The war is won," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "The killing must stop." Drogo's dark eyes studied her for a long moment. "You are queen now," he said, "but a queen who does not rule with strength will be torn from her throne." Daenerys met his gaze. "Strength is not just killing, Drogo." He narrowed his eyes but said nothing. This was not his way. The Dothraki did not conquer only to sit on thrones. They took what they wanted, burned what they did not. But she was not just his Khaleesi anymore. She was queen of the 7 kingdoms, and Westeros was not the Dothraki Sea. The next morning, the aftermath of the war became clear. The small folk, terrified of their new rulers, huddled in the ruins of the city, waiting for judgment. The remaining lords and ladies of Westeros, those who had not died in battle, were dragged before the throne. Among them was Sansa Stark, captured after she tried to flee the Red Keep. Daenerys stiffened when she saw her. The girl looked thin, pale, her blue eyes filled with both fear and defiance. She was Ned Stark's daughter, the blood of Winterfell. "Sansa Stark," Daenerys said, stepping forward, "I have no quarrel with you." Sansa's jaw clenched. "Your husband butchered my father's best friend, and your people have burned my city." Jorah Mormont tensed at those words, waiting to see how Daenerys would react. Drogo only smirked, amused by the little wolf's boldness. "This one has the fire of a warrior," he said. But Daenerys did not want fire anymore. She wanted order. "You will be sent back to Winterfell," she declared. "Your brother Robb Stark still holds the North. Go to him. Tell him I do not seek to make war against the Starks, but if he rises against me—" She met Sansa's gaze. "I will finish what Robert Baratheon started." Sansa's face remained stone cold, but she nodded. She would leave King's Landing alive, for now. As Sansa rode north, she carried news of what had happened. King Robert was dead. Cersei Lannister was a prisoner. The Iron Throne belonged to Daenerys Stormborn. But in the cold halls of Winterfell, Robb Stark listened in grim silence. "The Targaryens have returned," he muttered, "and they have brought monsters with them." The North would not kneel easily, and the war was not over yet. Winter had come to Westeros. The banners of House Stark flew high over Winterfell, their direwolf sigil snapping in the cold wind. In the great hall, Robb Stark stood before his lords, his face grim as he listened to his sister's account of King's Landing's fall. "The Targaryen girl sits the Iron Throne," Sansa said, "and she has a Dothraki army at her command." The gathered lords muttered among themselves, some exchanging uneasy glances. Lord Greatjon Umber slammed a fist onto the table. "Then we march south and cut the savage bitch down." "She spared my life," Sansa said sharply. "She does not want war with the North." The Greatjon scoffed. "A Targaryen does not spare anything. She's waiting to tighten her grip." Robb tapped his fingers against the arm of his chair. "What of Cersei Lannister?" "Imprisoned," Sansa answered. "Joffrey was sent into exile. The Lannisters have lost their power." Rose Bolton, who had remained silent until now, spoke in his usual calm, eerie tone. "A queen who overthrows the lion but does not kill it is either a fool or dangerously cunning." Robb exhaled. So she does not yet seek to make an enemy of the North, but she will eventually. The room fell silent, and then from the shadows a voice spoke. We do not need to wait for war to come to us. Jon Snow stepped forward. The bastard of Winterfell was no longer a boy standing in his brother's shadow. He had seen things beyond the wall. He knew of the war that was greater than any throne in the South. But this was not a battle for words. It was a battle for survival. Robb turned to Jon. What are you suggesting? Jon's gray eyes burned like steel. We ride south, not to swear fealty, not to bargain. He clenched his fist. We take back Westeros in the name of the North. The great Jon let out a roar of approval. The room erupted in voices, some shouting for war, others urging caution. But Robb Stark had already made his decision. The North would rise, and Daenerys Targaryen would not keep her throne for long. Far to the south, in the ruins of King's Landing, Daenerys Targaryen walked through the smoldering streets. The Dothraki had taken their spoils, but she had forbidden further slaughter. She had won, but victory had left her feeling hollow. Jorah Mormont stepped beside her. The city will need rebuilding. Daenerys nodded absent-mindedly. And the lords of Westeros? Jorah hesitated. The North is restless. Daenerys sighed. They will not kneel easily. Before Jorah could answer, the doors to the throne room burst open. Drogo entered, his leather armor still stained with blood. He grinned. The North gathers its forces. They march against you. Daenerys' heart clenched. She had hoped to rule without more war. But war was coming all the same. Drogo leaned in, whispering into her ear. Let me burn them. She turned, her violet eyes meeting his dark ones. The North are my people, Drogo. They are weak, he said. I will crush them before they become a threat. For the first time, Daenerys hesitated. Drogo was her husband, her strength, her warlord. But the Seven Kingdoms were not the Dothraki Sea. If she allowed him to unleash the full might of his horde, there would be no kingdom left to rule. She turned back to her throne. The war for Westeros was not over yet. The cold winds of the north clashed with the burning fires of the south. The Stark banners flew high as Robb Stark, Jon Snow, and the lords of the north marched toward King's Landing. Over 30,000 men strong, they moved like a storm, determined to tear the Dragon Queen from her stolen throne. They were not alone. The Vale, led by Jon Royce, had answered the call. The Riverlands, still loyal to House Tully, stood behind Robb. Even remnants of the Baratheon bannermen, furious over Robert's death, had joined the rebellion. Westeros was divided once again. Fire and ice would meet in battle. In King's Landing, Daenerys stood at the battlements of the Red Keep, watching the enemy approach. They came as wolves and lions, as old blood demanding vengeance. Beside her, Khal Drogo stood like an unshaken mountain, his auroch glinting in the afternoon sun. Behind them, 50,000 Dothraki warriors waited, their bloodlust unquenched. I will ride through them all, Drogo promised, his dark eyes burning. I will burn their fields and take their heads for our son's cradle. Daenerys exhaled, placing a hand on her stomach. She was with child. The air of fire and blood grew within her, but was this the world she wanted to bring him into? She had conquered Westeros, but was she truly its queen or just its destroyer? The North would not kneel, and now she had to decide. Would she be the queen who ruled, or the queen who burned everything to the ground? The North struck first. Robb Stark, the young wolf, led a brutal cavalry charge, cutting through Daenerys' Westerosi supporters like a blade through flesh. Jon Snow fought beside him, long claw gleaming as he cut down Dothraki riders. But the Dothraki were too fast, too brutal. The battlefield became a graveyard, with thousands trampled beneath hooves. From the walls, Daenerys watched the carnage unfold. This was not what she had wanted, but she knew that if she faltered, she would lose everything. She turned to her soldiers. "Light the trenches!" Fire erupted around King's Landing, cutting off the northern retreat. The Stark forces were trapped. And then, Drogo led the final charge. He rode like a god of war, his arak cutting through steel and flesh alike. He found Robb Stark on the battlefield and roared. Steel met steel, wolf against horse. Robb fought with everything he had, but Drogo was death itself. With a final, savage strike, he cut down the young wolf, his sword slicing through armor, splitting Robb's chest open. The northern banners fell. The last rebellion had failed. The battle was over. The north lay in ruins, the wolves slaughtered. But Daenerys did not feel victorious. She entered the battlefield, her boots sinking into the blood-soaked mud. She saw Jon Snow kneeling beside Robb's body, his sword discarded, his face empty with grief. He did not fight when the Dothraki grabbed him. He did not speak when they dragged him to the Red Keep, and when they threw him before her throne, he finally looked up. "You have won," he said, his voice hollow. "Is this what you wanted?" Daenerys stared at him, the weight of the Iron Throne pressing upon her like never before. She had won, but she had lost everything to do it. The wolves were dead, the north was broken, and her kingdom was built on fire and blood. She closed her eyes. "No," she whispered. Drogo stepped forward, his arak raised, ready to finish the last wolf. Daenerys raised a hand. "No more." Drogo's eyes narrowed. "He is your enemy." "He is my blood," she said softly. "There has been enough death." Drogo gritted his teeth but said nothing. He would not fight her, but he did not understand her mercy. Daenerys knelt before Jon, her violet eyes meeting his gray ones. "This is my throne," she whispered, "but it is built on the bones of my enemies." Jon's face remained emotionless. "Then it will never be yours." She swallowed hard. "Then I will make it mine." She turned away from him, her heart as heavy as the throne she sat upon. Westeros belonged to her now. But was it worth the price? Years passed. The Dothraki ruled the Seven Kingdoms, a force never seen before. Westeros had changed forever. Khal Drogo, the warrior king, remained Daenerys' strength. Their son grew strong, a child of two worlds, raised on both the ash of conquest and the whispers of prophecy. And Jon Snow? He was banished, sent beyond the wall, a ghost of the past. He was the last wolf, the last memory of the old Westeros. But he would always remember, because the North never forgets, and winter always comes again.